Will you marry my daddy instead? What kind of heartbreak forces a woman nearly 50 to stand alone at a station for 3 long days waiting for a husband who never came? What kind of silence eats away at dignity when the world whispers she is too old, too unwanted, too forgotten? And yet could a single question from a child in dusty boots open the door to the love and belonging she thought would never be hers? The train whistle had long since faded into the hills, leaving only the restless shuffle of boots on the platform at Sage Bluff. For 3 days, Clara had stood there, her carpet bag at her feet, and her fingers curled around a folded letter whose ink had begun to blur from the touch of her thumb. 3 days of waiting, 3 days of eyes on her pitying, mocking, dismissive. She was nearly 50, her dark hair threaded with silver, her figure fuller than most women her age dared to show. To the townsfolk who passed through the station, she was little more than a curiosity. They whispered behind gloved hands. The mail-order bride no one claimed. Some chuckled outright, saying she looked more like someone's weary aunt than a woman fit to be chosen. But Clara did not bow her head. She stood with the posture of someone who had endured harder humiliations. A husband once forced upon her and lost in violence. A family that had shaved her dignity down to nothing with cruel words. A lifetime of being told she was too much or not enough. If she let every whisper pierce her, she would have collapsed long ago. The station master had suggested she go back east on the return train. "No man worth his boots leaves a lady waiting this long," he muttered. But Clara refused. Perhaps it was stubbornness, perhaps foolish hope, but she believed promises still mattered, even if the world had taught her otherwise. On the third evening, as the prairie sun sank into a haze of copper and violet, she was alone on the platform. Her bag felt heavier than ever. She whispered to herself, "Just one more day." It was then she heard it, the uneven clop of small boots on the wooden planks. A girl no older than 8 stood there, dust clinging to her dress, her braids loose. Her eyes, bright but tired, fixed on Clara with a boldness far beyond her years. The child tugged at Clara's skirt, lifted her chin, and said softly, "Ma'am, will you marry my daddy instead?" The words landed like thunder in the silence. Clara's breath caught. She looked around, expecting someone to laugh to explain this cruel jest. But no one came. Only the child, with her boots too big for her feet, waiting for an answer. In that moment, something shifted in Clara. She had been waiting for a man who did not come, but perhaps destiny had arrived in the form of a child's plea. The longing in those young eyes was not born of mischief. It was born of hunger for safety, for family, for a woman's presence that had been missing too long. Still, doubt curled around Clara's heart. She was weary, scarred, and uncertain she had any love left to give. What could a woman like her possibly offer a lonely cowboy and his child? Yet the girl's voice lingered like a prayer. "Will you marry my daddy instead?" That night, as she walked to the dim boarding house at the edge of town, Clara carried more than her bag. She carried a question that would not leave her. Was this accidental meeting a cruel reminder of what she'd never have, or the very beginning of something she had been waiting her whole life to find? She pressed the worn letter to her chest, closed her eyes, and let the prairie wind move through her hair. For the first time in 3 days, she did not feel abandoned. She felt summoned. And though she could not yet see it, the path of her life had just turned. When a child's simple plea becomes the seat of destiny, can a woman who has endured a lifetime of rejection dare to believe in a new beginning? The child's words echoed through Clara's mind long after she had left the station. Sleep was scarce that night, her thoughts restless as the prairie winds rattled the shutters of the boarding house. By dawn, she had decided she could not dismiss what had happened, not the look in the girl's eyes nor the trembling courage it took to speak those words. When she returned to the station the next morning, the child was waiting. Her boots were caked in dust, her dress patched and frayed, but her gaze was steady. She carried no doll, no ribbon, nothing of childhood frivolity, only a folded scrap of paper in her small hand. She held it out. "He's my daddy. His name's Thomas Hale. He don't come to town much. Too much work. He said maybe God would send us help. I reckon maybe that's you." The note was brief, written in an uneven but earnest hand. "If this reaches the right woman, I've got a ranch that's falling apart, and a daughter I can't raise alone. I'm no poet, but I'll do my best to be honest. If you come, I'll meet you with gratitude. Thomas Hale." It wasn't a love letter, not even a promise. It was a plea. Clara's hands shook as she folded it back. "Child," she whispered, "you don't even know me." The girl tilted her head, studying her with solemn eyes. "You stayed 3 days. Folks who leave don't wait that long." There was no argument against that truth. By midday, Clara found herself in a wagon rattling down the rutted road to Sky Creek, the child sitting close beside her. The girl introduced herself as Anna, 8 years old, though her voice carried the weariness of someone twice her age. She spoke of calves gone sick of a roof that leaked, of nights when the fire burned too low, because her father's strength was nearly spent. As the wagon climbed the ridge, Clara glimpsed the Hale Ranch. It wasn't much, just a weather-beaten cabin leaning against the wind, a barn with slats missing, and fields gone half to weeds. Yet there was something noble in its struggle to endure, as though the land itself refused to give up. On the porch stood a man, broad-shouldered, but weary, his hat shading eyes that carried more shadow than light. His left hand rested on the rail, as though it were all that kept him upright. When the wagon stopped, Anna leapt out, running to him. "Papa," she came. Thomas looked up, his eyes narrowing against the sun. His gaze fell on Clara, a stranger plain in her dress with lines etched deep from years of toil and sorrow. He said nothing at first. The silence stretched heavy with caution. Finally he spoke, voice low and gravelly. "You're not the woman I wrote to." "No," Clara answered softly. "But I was the one who stayed." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, even relief. But it vanished quickly, replaced with the guarded look of a man who had learned too often that hope was dangerous. Anna tugged at his sleeve. "She's kind, Papa." She waited. He crouched to meet his daughter's eyes, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "Child," he murmured, "kindness is scarce in this world. Don't spend it too quick." Then, standing, he looked at Clara once more. "If you've got work in you, there's plenty here. But I won't chain you to this place. You came of your own will, you'll leave the same." It wasn't a welcome, not truly, but it wasn't a dismissal either. And for Clara, who had been turned away from so many doors in her life, that sliver of space, a chance, was more than she had dared to hope for. As the sun dipped low, Clara carried her carpet bag into the Hale cabin. The air inside smelled faintly of wood smoke and weary years. She set her things down and drew a long breath. Perhaps she had not come to the home she expected, but she had come home nonetheless. When a woman who has known only rejection steps into a place built on survival and silence, can she truly find belonging, or will the shadows of the past swallow her whole? The first nights at the Hale cabin were a study in silence. Clara rose early, long before the rooster crowed, to tend the fire and sweep the hearth. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned not to take up too much space, her steps soft, her breath steady. Thomas spoke little. He ate the meal she set on the table, stew that stretched scraps bread baked from the last of the flour, with a kind of solemn gratitude but no flourish of thanks. It wasn't rudeness, Clara came to realize, but habit. This was a man who had spent years letting grief sit across from him at supper. Words were simply not part of his daily ration. Anna, the little girl, filled the silences with questions. She asked about the town Clara had come from, about the color of the church windows there, about whether flowers could still grow in a heart that had been stepped on too many times. Clara answered as best she could, sometimes with words, sometimes with a hand smoothing the child's hair. But in the quiet hours when the dishes were done and the lamplight flickered, low doubt crept in. She wondered if she had made a mistake walking into a man's life without invitation, a man who still watched her with wary eyes, as though waiting for her to vanish like so many promises before. One evening, as a storm rattled the windows, Clara carried a pail of water from the pump. Her hands were stiff with cold when she stepped back inside. Thomas was by the fire mending a harness. He glanced up at her, then back down at the leather, his silence pressing like weight against the walls. "Do you want me here, Mr. Hale?" She asked the question, slipping out before she could swallow it back. The room stilled. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he set the harness aside, his broad hands resting on his knees. "Wants a tricky word," he said at last. His voice was low, rough like gravel turned over by wagon wheels. "I wanted a wife who'd ease the burdens. I wanted a partner. But life doesn't give a man what he wants. It gives what's left." The words stung more than she expected, but there was no cruelty in his tone, only a weary honesty. Clara lowered her gaze, nodding once. Then softer, he added, "But my little girl, she looks at you like you belong, and that counts more than what I think I deserve." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even kindness. Yet it was something. And for Clara, who had lived through years of words sharper than knives, even that small recognition was enough to steady her heart for another day. That night she lay awake listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the cabin walls. She thought about the lives she had left behind, the men who dismissed her, the family who treated her as less than whole, the years where hope had been a candle snuffed out by ridicule. Now here she was in a place that wasn't hers with people who weren't hers. And yet, maybe the choice to stay could make them hers in time. The storm outside eased into a hush, but inside her heart a storm remained, the ache of being wanted just enough to be useful, but not enough to be cherished. What happens when a woman who has been strong too long begins to wonder if she deserves more than duty, if she deserves tenderness? The following days unfolded in small, deliberate rhythms. Clara tended to the hearth-sewed patches into Anna's dresses and made broth that stretched thin ingredients into something filling. She didn't complain, though her hands ached and her back stiffened with each passing night. Work, after all, had been her lifelong companion. But in the pauses when Anna was at play and Thomas was out mending fences, Clara found herself staring at the doorway, a quiet ache tugging at her chest. She had come here on faith, answering a promise written in a child's eyes, but each day the question grew louder inside her. Was she a guest or was she family? One evening the three of them sat at supper. The stew bubbled gently, lantern light flickering against the rough wooden beams. Anna chattered about the calf born that morning, about how its legs wobbled as if it didn't yet believe in its own bones. Clara smiled, listening, until Anna asked suddenly, "Papa, is Miss Clara staying forever?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Thomas's spoon stilled halfway to his mouth. He looked at his daughter, then at Clara. "That's for Miss Clara to decide," he said slowly. Clara's heart skipped, not at the words, but at the way he spoke them, as if he truly meant her choice mattered. For a woman whose choices had so often been stolen or dismissed, the recognition was startling, even tender. Later that night, after Anna had been tucked in, Clara stepped onto the porch. The moon hung low, spilling silver over the fields. Thomas joined her, leaning against the railing, his hands rough and steady. "You've carried a lot for someone else's family," he said quietly. "More than I expected." Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around the shawl at her shoulders. "I've carried a lot all my life, Mr. Hale. Sometimes because I chose to. Sometimes because I had no choice." He nodded, his jaw working as though wrestling with unspoken thoughts. Finally he said, "I don't want you thinking you're just here to fill a hole. You're not a replacement." His voice broke a little on the word, the wound of his late wife's memory still raw. Clara's throat tightened, and yet sometimes I feel like a shadow in another woman's home. The silence that followed was not harsh, but heavy. Then Thomas turned, his eyes meeting hers, earnest and steady. "You're not a shadow, Clara. You're the reason Anna laughs again." The words struck her deeper than she let on. She had been called many things in her life, burden, mistake, too much, too little, but never the reason. That night when she lay down on her narrow cot, she felt something unfamiliar. The beginnings of belonging, fragile as the first green shoot, pushing through winter's thaw. Still doubt lingered. Belonging born of usefulness was not the same as being cherished. And Clara, though weathered by years of endurance, still carried the secret hope that someone might see her, not as duty, but as gift. The prairie wind howled outside, rattling the shutters as if echoing her question into the night. Could she ever be more than the woman who stayed out of necessity? Could she be chosen freely, truly, for who she was? What happens when duty begins to turn into something softer, something dangerous, something that asks for the heart? Spring crept onto the land in uneven strokes. Some mornings the air was warm enough to coax the buds on the apple trees, while others still carried the sting of winter. In those weeks, Clara found herself balancing between comfort and restlessness, between gratitude and doubt. She rose early each day, coaxing the fire back to life, cooking porridge for Anna, and preparing bread for the evening meal. She never complained, but deep within a question smoldered. Was this her place, or was she simply passing through a story that was not hers to keep? The answer seemed to tilt one way or another, depending on Thomas's gaze. Some days he was warm, thanking her, with a quiet nod after a long day's work, his eyes lingering on her longer than before. Other days he pulled back into silence, as though afraid that to lean on her meant betraying a memory. The moment that changed everything came one afternoon when the town's supply wagon rattled in. Clara accompanied Thomas and Anna to the general store. The moment they stepped inside, whispers began to stir like snakes in the grass. "Is that the woman staying at the Hale Ranch?" one woman muttered. "Poor thing. Guess some men will take anyone to mind their children," another sneered. Clara kept her chin high, but her cheeks burned. Anna, holding Clara's hand, stiffened and looked up at her with wide, questioning eyes. Thomas heard it too. His shoulders tensed, but he said nothing, just paid for the flour and beans and stepped outside. Clara followed the silence between them louder than the gossip left behind. Once the wagon was loaded, she turned to him, voice taut. "You heard them?" "I did. And you said nothing." Thomas gripped the reins, jaw set. "Words from bitter tongues don't deserve the air they take, but they cut all the same," Clara replied, her voice trembling. "Do you know what it is to live 50 years being told you are not wanted, only to hear it again when you've given your whole self to help?" Thomas turned to her, then his eyes raw. "And do you know what it is to bury a wife and hear every whisper that you've moved on too soon or not soon enough? The town always talks, Clara. They don't know what it costs to keep going." The words struck both of them, jagged and sharp. Clara looked away, her heart pounding. "Then perhaps I am only here because I make things easier. Perhaps you never wanted me here at all." The silence that followed was unbearable. Even Anna, usually chatter-filled, sat still on the wagon seat, clutching Clara's sleeve as though sensing the storm. That night, Clara lay awake on her narrow cot, tears slipping into her pillow. She had endured ridicule before, but this cut deeper. For the first time since she'd arrived, she considered leaving. She imagined the long train ride back east, her life folding in on itself once more like a book no one bothered to read. But then she thought of Anna, the little girl's laughter, when Clara braided her hair, the way she whispered "Good night, Mama" by mistake, more often than not. And Clara's heart clenched. Leaving would protect her pride, yes, but it would also abandon a child who had chosen her long before she had chosen herself. The choice ahead was not between staying or leaving. It was between protecting her own heart or risking it for the fragile chance of love and belonging. And Clara, though weary, had not come this far to shrink away from hope. What happens when the heart reaches its breaking point? Will it retreat into silence or dare to step closer to love? The morning after that tense silence, the ranch felt colder than the prairie wind. Clara moved through her chores like a shadow, feeding the hens, kneading bread, patching Anna's dress. Yet her heart was heavy, tethered by doubt. But children have a way of drawing truth to the surface. That evening after supper, Anna climbed onto Clara's lap with tearful eyes. "Are you going to leave like Mama did?" the little girl whispered. Clara's breath caught. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, stroking the child's hair. "I'm not your mama. I could never take her place." Anna pressed closer. "I don't want you to take her place. I just don't want you to go." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. In that fragile moment, she understood love was not about replacing what was lost, but about showing up anyway, scars and all. That night, Clara stood by the porch railing, staring into the dark fields where fireflies blinked like lanterns carried by unseen hands. Behind her, footsteps approached. Thomas. His presence filled the air, uncertain yet steady. "You're thinking of leaving," he said quietly. Clara turned to face him, the lamplight casting shadows across her lined face. "I thought about it, but then Anna asked me not to go. And I realized she's right. I don't want to go either." Thomas's eyes softened, though his voice trembled. "Clara, I've failed you. I let those cruel words cut you without standing between you and them. I thought silence would protect us, but it only hurt more." Clara shook her head, her voice firm though gentle. "It's not your silence that wounded me, Thomas. It's my own fear that I am always just a burden, always tolerated, but never chosen." For a long moment the night held them both. Then Thomas stepped closer, his hand rough from years of labor reaching for hers. She hesitated, then allowed his fingers to intertwine with hers. "You are not a burden," he said, voice low but strong. "Clara, I've watched the way you carry this house, the way you hold Anna's tears, the way you keep going even when the world sneers. You are the bravest woman I've ever known." Clara's lips parted, but no words came. She had been waiting her whole life to be seen, not for her appearance, not for what she could provide, but for her very being. Thomas continued, his throat tight. "I don't want you here just because of Anna. I want you here because I need you. Because this place, this life, it only feels alive again when you're in it." The words cracked something open in Clara's chest. Years of rejection, ridicule, and silence gave way to a sob that shook her shoulders. Not of despair this time, but of release. Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she was something precious. For the first time in decades, Clara did not shrink or apologize for her tears. She let them fall, soaking into the shirt of a man who did not turn away. When the sobs eased, Thomas lifted her chin, his eyes steady. "Stay, Clara, not as a helper, not as a placeholder. Stay as yourself, as the woman who makes this broken ranch a home again." Clara searched his face, the earnestness etched in every line. She felt the last of her fear slip away. "I will," she whispered. The prairie wind swept across the fields, carrying the scent of lilacs and rain. And for the first time in years, Clara felt her soul breathe free. What happens when the walls finally fall and love is no longer feared, but embraced? The days that followed were not perfect. The town still whispered when Clara walked through with Thomas and Anna by her side. Some women turned away, some men smirked. But Clara no longer carried their shadows. She carried something greater, the warmth of a hand that never let go. One Sunday morning, as they stepped into the small wooden church, silence rippled across the pews. The widow who had once been called too much now walked with her head high, Thomas steady at her side, Anna clinging to her skirts. Clara felt the stares, but for the first time she did not flinch. During the hymn, Anna's small voice rang out, off-key but bold, and Clara joined her, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each verse. Thomas glanced at her, his lips curving in a quiet smile that said, "Everything, you belong here." That evening the three of them sat on the porch. Anna curled in Clara's lap, drifting to sleep as the prairie sky melted into streaks of gold and lavender. Thomas carved a small wooden figure in silence, his hand steady. Clara looked out at the horizon, her heart full. For so long she had believed her story was one of rejection, of being tolerated at best and ridiculed at worst. But here in this quiet ranch house, she had discovered the truth. Dignity was not given by others. It was lived, chosen, carried like a lantern through the darkest nights until it lit a home. Thomas set down his carving and looked at her. "Clara," he said softly, "you've given me back more than I ever thought I'd find again. Not just a mother for Anna, not just help for the ranch. You've given me a reason to breathe, to laugh, to hope." Her throat tightened, but she did not look away. "And you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever," she whispered. "A place where I am not too much, a place where I am exactly enough." They sat together as the first stars appeared, Anna's gentle breathing mingling with the song of crickets. The night was not grand, not marked by any great event. And yet for Clara, it was the kind of night she had prayed for in silence, ordinary, safe, filled with love. For the first time in her 50 years, she believed the words she had longed to hear. "You are wanted, you are loved, you are home." And so the woman once mocked for her size, once cast aside as unworthy, became the heart of a family chosen, not in spite of who she was, but because of it. Because sometimes love does not arrive in youth or beauty or triumph. Sometimes it comes later, when the world believes your best years are gone. Sometimes it arrives quietly on a porch at dusk, in the trust of a child, in the steady hand of a man who sees you as gold. And that, Clara thought, is enough. More than enough. For those who have been told they are too much or not enough, perhaps the prairie has one last truth to whisper: you are exactly what someone has been waiting for. The question is, will you let yourself believe it? Sometimes the loneliest seasons of our lives lead us to the very place we were always meant to be. Clara thought she was forgotten after waiting 3 days at that empty station, her heart growing heavier with each hour. But life in its quiet way surprised her, not through grand gestures, but through the small voice of a child in worn boots, asking a question that changed everything. It reminds us that healing doesn't always arrive in the ways we expect. Sometimes it comes in the trust of a child, in the steady kindness of a man who sees us not for what the world mocks, but for who we are when we keep showing up with dignity. And maybe that's a lesson we can all carry. Love may not come when we demand it, but it has a way of finding us when we're finally ready to be seen. Here on None, Wild West Saga. We believe these stories matter because they echo truths we all live with about lost resilience and the courage to open our hearts again. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Would you like to see what happened next in Clara's life? Or hear more stories of second chances and unexpected families? Share your reflections in the comments. I read every word. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe, share, and join this growing circle of kindred spirits. Together, we'll keep these healing tales alive.